Whilst traditionally seen as exclusively an architectural style, can Brutalism's adoption of exposed materials, as well as its striking appearance and grayscale exteriors, be replicated in graphic design? Can graphic design reflect the honesty and integrity that the best of Brutalist architecture embodied? Brutalism's roots lie in modernism, an artistic and architectural movement from the 1930s that adopted new building techniques to create sleek, bold shapes and sharp edges that rejected previous architectural styles. An influential figure in the development of what would become Brutalism was a Swiss architect called Le Corbusier and his Unité de Habitation, a series of buildings that focused on communal living in a vertical garden city. In Britain, architects were inspired by Le Corbusier, and the term Brutalism gained popularity through architect Rainer Bainham's 1955 essay, The New Brutalism. Notably, architects such as Allison and Peter Smithson, Denys Lasdun and the firm Chamberlain, Powell and Bon employed Brutalism in the construction of many public buildings, such as universities, galleries and libraries. The Brutalist and Modernist movements both rejected the ornamentation and excesses of past styles. Despite this, where Bauhaus expressed functionality in its design and architectural styles, Brutalism emphasized the use of raw materials and expression. Brutalism was also employed on a wider scale during the construction of new towns, an extensive building initiative that envisaged a more modern, utopian way of life. These dreams were short-lived, however. The juxtaposition of architectural vision and demand for cheap housing created poor quality builds that were a far cry from modern utopia. Indeed, some of the high-rise structures became dangerous to live in, such as the Rona Point Tower, which partially collapsed in 1968. Inevitably, British Brutalism became associated with failed visions, poor quality, and a dystopian vision of the future, and to the relief of many, the style dropped out of fashion in the 1980s. In recent years, Brutalism has been reappraised. The few examples of Brutalist housing estates remaining have seen regeneration, and some have even been classified as architectural landmarks, like Sheffield's Park Hill Flats and the Barbican in London. Ironically, once built as a vision of egalitarian living, they have become overpriced and out of reach of the very people they were built for. Author Owen Hatherley wrote, "Brutalism was never just an architectural style, it was a political aesthetic, an attitude, a weapon, dedicated to the precept that nothing was too good for ordinary people. After decades of neglect, its buildings are now either eyesores or icons, fine for the Barbican stockbrokers, but unacceptable for the people who were always its intended inhabitants." Regarding graphic design, modernism has undoubtedly had a large influence, with designers such as Jan Tschichold, Joseph Brockman, and Herbert Bayer to name a few. Modernism as a graphic design style, pioneered by the Bauhaus movement in the 1920s, was further developed by Swiss designers after World War II. Heavy emphasis was placed on grid systems, typographic layout, and simple and functional design. Brutalism in graphic design is less known, however. Today, when talking about Brutalism within graphic design, most think of web design, which in recent years has adopted the Brutalist name to encompass the bare and unadorned aesthetic that intentionally mimics the early underdeveloped designs that populated the internet in its first years. Brutalism has seemingly moved from brushhammer concrete walls to digital interfaces. The phenomenon has been documented by Pascal Deville, whose website archives the various examples of so-called Brutalist web design. Deville sees the revival as a reaction against the clean and material corporate design that has dominated graphic design in recent years. Digital Brutalist graphic design ignores the egalitarianism that Brutalism was originally built around and instead revels in its bleak and raw characteristics. Images are left unedited and incorporated with default typefaces to mimic exposed and raw building materials. Colour is unadventurous and kept to a minimum, whilst typography is oversized to reflect the imposing nature of concrete structures. This should not be confused with anti-design, another relatively modern digital aesthetic that, while sharing some attributes with digital Brutalism, purposely uses clashing colours, unclear hierarchies, and ineligible text to create intentionally ugly designs. Brutalism in graphic design isn't all limited to digital interfaces, however. The common traits of the style are also able to be replicated in physical forms. An example of this is Chris Ashworth's work. His gritty approach to typographic image combines letter-set text with fragmented layering of raw materials. The outcome looks like a broken down and bastardized interpretation of modernist design, the cleanliness and systematic nature of which has been gradually deconstructed over time. Ashworth calls this style Swiss grit, an example of what happens when brutalism and graphic design merge in a physical form. Ashworth's design is a continuation of the themes present in the Raygun publication, which he worked for alongside David Carson. He describes the style used in Raygun as a lot of negative space, gridded composition, sans type, etc., but it has an organic, handmade touch to it, the grit part. Swiss typography and design is the bedrock of all great graphic design, but it is soulless. I've tried to bring some soul to it. It seems then that whilst brutalism has become alienated from its founding socialist principles within architecture, it can be said to have rediscovered an egalitarian and humane vision within graphic design. Finally, graphic design such as Ashworth's and the brutalist web design aesthetic captures brutalism's transparency about the materials used and its commitment to rejecting embellishment.